I'm Cassie. I'm also going to be talking about GMOs. So my colleague's claim of fact was genetically modified food will provide significant advantages to consumers. His secondary claims are GM food is nutritionally equivalent to non-GM food. GM food has advantages over non-GM food, and humanity's future food needs depend on GM food. So for his first claim, he refers to a study that's done by UC Davis that shows that GM food is nutritionally equivalent to non-GM food. But when I looked it up, there was on the Natural News, they showed that that studies done at UC Davis on GM foods were funded by the biotech industry who work on GM products, and so the outcomes of these studies would be biased in the favor of GM foods being perceived as, nutritionally equivalent, because that's how they're getting their funding from people who want it to be. Also, the Natural News showed that they did a corn comparison report, and they were nutritionally void compared to regular corn. Real corn had 437 times more calcium in the real corn than the GM corn, and 56 times more magnesium. So you're getting way more vitamins in real corn than GM corn, according to this. In his second claim, GM food advantages over non-GM food, has advantages over non-GM food. He referred to an article published by the New York Times outlining how and why the FDA approved a genetically modified potato, and he goes on to say that it's because GM food provides advantages to consumers. When I read the article, it says that $1 million were poured into campaigns to defeat the ballot for labeling of these potatoes as genetically modified. So if they're saying that they have advantages, but they still don't want to label it on their food. And also, when I looked it up on WebMD, it was saying that the major disadvantages of GM food is GMOs can cause new allergies and can hurt the effects of antibiotics. And also, there's the rise of super weeds. Crops built to withstand weed killer could breed with weeds, and these super weeds can survive, and farmers will have to use stronger and stronger pesticides to compensate for that. The third claim that humanity's future depends on GM foods. He uses an article by the MIT Technology Review and says that the article states why GM crops could potentially increase crop yield. The article also says that the promise that genetically modified foods could help feed the world has been somewhat of an empty promise. So in the same article that he was saying supports the idea that GM foods will be the future of our food, also says that it won't be. So I don't think that article really has any credibility. So with all these points, I think I've successfully refuted his argument.
All right, the structural stuff is all good. On the first point, you challenge the source that the advocate used, and you're suggesting bias there, and that's primarily because of financial bias. I think that that's a good press to make, and I like the fact that you've got some information that you're using to cite on that particular point. I'm not sure that I'm convinced that because something is funded by the industry, that means that it's predetermined what the outcome is going to be. That seems to suggest that the researchers at UC Davis basically were worthless, and they were just being paid to say whatever that company wanted them to say, and I think you'd have to have a little bit better evidence of that. But the notion that this is not independent, I think that's the argument that you want to be emphasizing, that there isn't any independent information that substantiates this that's not funded by the industry. I think that would be a good way of going about it. I like the example that you had here. I thought this was the clearest example of information where there is a difference in the nutritional value, and it's not a positive difference, it's a negative one. The lack of calcium and the lack of magnesium in the corn product, for instance, I thought that was a good citation that illustrates the point that you're talking about. And even if it's just a single example, it does seem to counteract the evidence or the lack of evidence that the advocate presented on that particular point. On the second point, I was a little bit confused as to the argument that you're making about the New York Times article. It sounds like it's really about labeling. I'm not sure the fact that they don't want labeling means that there's something wrong with the product. I think you're making an inference there that's not necessarily a valid one. I did think your citation, though, of WebMD was helpful. You need to be quoting people a little bit more directly. That was one of the things that I think was a little bit of a problem. You mentioned the superweeds, for instance, at this point, and I didn't know if that was a separate article, a separate piece of information, or if that's also extended from the WebMD article. And I had the same problem on the later part where you're talking about the MIT quote, and they say that it's been an empty promise. That's where we want the direct quote. Give us the sentence that you're referring to here, because I think that that's a very good refutation of that particular point, and it should be emphasized that it comes from the source that the advocate presented, that this has largely been an empty promise. And you seem to lose confidence in your presentation at this point. I don't know why you lose confidence. You should come back and just summarize. The only evidence that shows that there's a nutritional difference shows that it's not a positive one. There's evidence that shows that there are significant negative consequences, and the only evidence that talks about whether or not it's going to save the future, his own evidence says it's been largely an empty promise so far. So I don't think you can reach the conclusion that the advocate's talking about. You got to be a little bit more forceful. You kind of bail out at the speech at the end. All right, thank you.